Hello all, welcome. We are today going to do about a 15-minute video and then some primary source work, so it should be a relatively light day. Today we're going to be talking a little bit more about fascism. Yesterday we talked about, you guys read about Hitler, but these are kind of the three big fascist governments. This is Italy, which was led by Mussolini. We're not going to talk about them quite as much. It's kind of very similar to Hitler, but like Hitler light. And then over here you have Japan, which is another country that went fascist. I'd want to make sure that I had my notebook open, that I had this note, this definition of fascism up. And what I'd like you to do is use your notebook, and I'd like you to take some quick notes on these three. Take about maybe 2 minutes total to look through them. Look for things that are similar across these three pieces of propaganda. Look for things that you think they have in common. You might think about this definition of fascism and kind of apply it. So where are you seeing this kind of thing? What are the items that you see in common? If there's something that's totally different about one, maybe note that as well. All right, take your 2 minutes. Do, 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 do. Do 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 do. All right, that was your intermission music. So looking at this, I think you guys should look at your list and see what you saw. But in each of these, you see obviously a figure in the front. You see a lot of military stuff. They're all wearing military uniforms. Mussolini and Hitler were both not active members of the military, but they regularly wore military uniforms to show that they were a part of the strong army of the nation. You see military stuff a lot. Mussolini's got this gun behind him. This Japanese poster has planes and tanks and all of that behind them. Germany has this kind of eagle up here, which kind of looks like a plane. You also see behind both of these two the mass of people, kind of showing that this person represents the masses. In all of them, they're taking kind of heroic stances, fighting stances, moving forward, defending the country. These two both have the flag prominently displayed. These are all pieces of propaganda that are focused on things that nationalism has, that kind of extreme right-wing concept of loyalty to one's country and patriotism, the need for that strong central government, the need for the country to band together and respect authority and work together to achieve goals that are often expansive and taking over other countries. So these kind of all show fascism. So today we're going to talk about Japan here, which is, I think, one of the more fascinating of the three. We saw that Hitler came to power and Mussolini to the same extent came to power due to Great Depression causing massive unemployment, and the Nazi Party kind of had a solution. They had that enemy to blame, and so they were able to step into that void when maybe they normally wouldn't have even been listened to. Japan is a little different. So this is going back a little bit. You've already have samurai. I would write down Bushido would be the one I would want to write down. Maybe seppuku if you didn't know that right off the top of your head. But in Japan, going back thousands of years, the key force was these samurai, these warriors, these knights, and their concept of Bushido. So Bushido, as you remember, was this complex set of rules about what it meant to be a samurai. It was all about being loyal to people above you, following orders, doing your duty, being a strong military person. And this was the value that Japanese culture was built on for many years. If you did have a dishonorable moment or something bad happened, you were captured in battle, the only way to get your faith back was to get your value back to society was to commit seppuku, which was to ritually commit suicide. That way you remove that stain on your honor. So Japan has this culture, and it's a culture that's very unique. It built up on its own. Japan is an island country that's kind of off the coast, so it's isolated from things. We remember that the Mongols tried to invade. The Mongols, who took over that massive stretch into Europe, went for Japan and failed. There was that big storm that happened off the coast that wrecked their fleet both times it came. Japan took the concept of kamikaze, which means divine wind, meaning that the weather is being controlled by the gods who see Japan as the best country in the world and are willing to defend it. This also preserved Japanese isolation, which is a key thing. Japan's going to have hundreds of years in which it's all by itself. That doesn't mean they don't have contact with the outside world. Remember, Europeans came over and we read some primary sources and talked about that. But Japan really isolated itself from Europeans. They could only come in at Nagasaki, this port down here, and that was the only place they could trade. Japan took some of their firearms and their new crops, but they isolated the areas where Europeans could trade. They didn't allow Japanese civilians to have interactions with them. They really tried to keep them out. So this started happening around 1600, and for the next 250, 260 years, that's what happened. We have this one of them stamping out Christianity wherever it spread. They didn't allow anyone to land. But then by the time you get to the 1850s, things change. We've talked before about how you can't really isolate yourself from the world, and that if you do, you often have disastrous effects. Like in the Americas, they were isolated from Europe, so they didn't pick up all of the ideas that spread along the Silk Road, and so when Europeans came over, they didn't have any immunities to diseases, they didn't have as strong of weapons, and the Europeans were able to stomp out 90% of native populations because they were stronger. In Japan, kind of a similar thing happens on a small level. In the 1850s, the United States sends over this guy, Commodore Matthew Perry, with a fleet to Japan. And he doesn't come over to Nagasaki, where they're allowed to come. He comes into Edo, the capital, and he's in the harbor, and he shows off the massive weapons that the United States has. The fleet fires 73 guns all at once. They do target practice on an uninhabited island off the shore. And Japan and the rulers realize that they have fallen behind militarily, that these European powers and the United States have such massive advantages and weapons that they can be annihilated if these countries choose to. So Japan starts signing treaties with these countries saying that we will open up our country. And then they start to think that they need to preserve their national sovereignty, and they need to modernize. So from the 1860s to the 1930s, which is 70 years, but it's a very short period of time when you think about countries, Japan embraces European technology. They bring in Western experts to train a new army. They start building a modern navy, training modern soldiers, jumping up their industry so that they can build these things. All at the same time, they keep that idea of Bushido, the concept of loyalty and duty. So these two are going to be kind of a powerful combination between them. First of all, this military modernization, while also keeping those Japanese feudal ideas of samurai and seppuku and Bushido. So this whole thing happens, and it has impacts on society. So this is the feudal one we looked at in Japan. You had that emperor who is on top but has not really a ton of power. There's the shogun who holds the power along with the daimyo, and then there's these military samurai who are the warriors, and then the peasants and the merchants at the bottom. So Japan kind of transforms that, but it keeps kind of a similar structure. You still have the emperor as the head of state, and he still doesn't have a ton of power. He's divine, but the people are kind of ruling through his name. So here you see stuff that looks much more Western. You've got kind of a legislature, which they call the Imperial Diet, which has a House of Representatives and a House of Peers, so it kind of borrows from the United States and the United Kingdom. They have councils and courts and a cabinet. There's an armed forces that is a huge part of it, and then the citizens, who have some voting rights into the Diet, but a lot of these are appointed, much like in Japan there was this kind of hierarchical view. Now, it's probably not surprising, given the concept of Bushido and the importance of samurai and daimyo, that one of these entities in the middle here starts to dominate, starts to rule in the name of the emperor, and that is the armed forces. That in Japan, the armed forces become super powerful. They start infiltrating into the cabinet and becoming important cabinet people. The legislature's role kind of gets diminished, and the military starts really running things, and they start focusing on that modernization, on building massive armies and navies. And that kind of mixes well with that concept of Bushido and pushes them towards fascism. This idea that this military power can drag the country out of the Great Depression, because Japan felt it too, although not as strongly as other countries. And these armed forces really started to run the show. And the armed forces had an issue, because when you're building a modern thing, you need to have modern ships and planes, and you need to have modern weapons. So this first showed itself in the Russian-Japanese War. This happened in 1904. So only like 50 years after Japan decides to start modernizing, they get in a war with a European power, and they win. They get to preserve Korea. They get parts of this Russian land up here. But the main thing they gained is prestige and power. On the international scene, people realize that Japan is now a country that is not to be messed with. So Japan has this moment happen and thinks we've got to double down, put tons of stuff into our military. This is how we become a power. But that's a problem because Japan, as we remember geographically, is mostly mountainous. And those mountains don't have a lot of minerals and they're not easy to get to. You can grow some things on the plains, but there's still a lot of population packed into a small area. And there isn't a couple of things that you really need if you're going to have a modern war, which is oil and rubber. So Japan needs oil and they need rubber. Now, they could trade for them, and they do for many years, but that's a hard thing to do because you depend on other countries setting prices. It would be like right now if the United States, if all of our ventilators were made in China, and China suddenly decided not to send them over to us, we would be totally screwed for the coronavirus because we don't control our own supply chains. So Japan realizes it needs to control its own sources of oil and rubber. And there is a place where they think they can go and get it, and that's over in mainland Asia. So Japan comes up with this idea, which I want to write down, called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which sounds good. It's all of East Asia, so kind of Korea, China, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, that they are going to make this kind of co-prosperity sphere. So prosperity means doing well. So everybody's going to do well, which sounds good, but in reality has some issues. This is the Japanese empire's policy that Asia shouldn't be in the hands of Europeans. It should be led by Japan. But they also kind of move this in with this idea that if you remember back the kamikaze of Japan being protected by the gods, that the Japanese race was going to be at the top, and it was going to show all of the Chinese and Koreans and Vietnamese how to be better. So Japan was going to control it, and they would use military force to make this happen if needed. So the other countries didn't really jump for this, so Japan starts military expansion. So first they grab this big chunk of China, which China was having a hard time holding on to anyway, and then they invade China. And later on they invade down into Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia here to take land there where there's lots of rubber, lots of oil. So Japan is trying to secure its future by having access to rubber, access to oil, access to natural resources like food and clothing type things so that it can be a powerful world power. But in the process, you start to get some bad things happening. They have a hard time in China. They take big chunks of it, but they can't really take the whole thing over. China is obviously very massive. China also was weak when they first invaded because they were having a civil war. Chinese communists were fighting Chinese nationalists, which are kind of like capitalists or more of a democratic concept. But they stopped fighting each other and declared a ceasefire to fight the Japanese. So the communists were very good at being guerrilla warfare because they'd been doing that against the nationalists. So they were hidden up in these mountains, attacking Japanese supply trains. And then these nationalist armies were fighting kind of this retreating battle across China where they would burn things to make sure the Japanese couldn't use them. They would flood the river. It was really kind of becoming this war that Japan was getting bogged down in. And that leads us to some of the atrocities that happened. So the city's called Nanjing or Nanking. It kind of is pronounced both ways. So there's this Nanjing massacre. So if you look back at this map, there's Nanjing here. It's kind of a capital type city in China. So as the Japanese troops come closer and closer and take the city, it's kind of the end of this big campaign before they gear up for the next one. And so the troops are kind of released into the city. They're not very well guarded by their officers. And so there's a 6-week period after the capture of Nanjing in which Japanese troops kind of go wild. They are targeting citizens. They are massacring them. It's hard to tell exactly how many because they burn bodies and threw them in the river. But at the very lowest, it's 400,000. At the highest, it's 300,000. Most historians guess somewhere around 200,000 civilians were killed during this 6-week period. The Japanese troops rampaged through the city, burning things, raping civilian women, killing old men, killing anyone that they came in contact with, digging these massive ditches where they would make local populations bring these dead bodies, and they would throw them in and then burn them or bury them, sometimes alive. So it's this massive set of atrocities. It kind of reminds you of the Holocaust in a lot of ways, or what Stalin was doing in Russia. That is happening. I thought about showing you guys some documentary footage of it, but it's frankly so disturbing that I think it's better served if we look at this through some primary sources, which we're going to get to in a second. But I wanted to show you kind of two stories first of all, which kind of show the way that Japan's kind of national identity gets warped as it goes forward. So on the left here we see someone about to be beheaded, and so you might be excused to think this is, some sort of part of samurai culture, that this guy is somehow a samurai and is being beheaded as part of some ritual, but in fact that's a Chinese prisoner of war. Japan had that concept in Bushido that you never let yourself get captured, and China didn't have that same concept. So when its soldiers would surrender, the Japanese would sometimes take pleasure in torturing this person who, in their worldview, had disgraced himself. And so they would do things like, in this case, they're beheading him without the whole ritual, or they would burn them alive, or they would torture them. It's because they kind of didn't see them as quite as human, because they weren't living up to Japanese cultural values. And that's a big part of fascism, is this concept that our nation is better than everybody else, and these are the people who are holding us back, so we should be kind of allowed and encouraged to attack them. This one here is rather fascinating too. When I was a young person in 1998, there was this big, huge baseball thing happen where two big home run hitters, Mark McGwire and Sammy Sosa, were hitting home runs at a record pace. We're going to break the record, and we're kind of having this race. So every day in the paper for months at a time, you would have at the very top of the front page a picture of each of them and then a number next to it which showed how many home runs they've hit. So this same kind of thing happened in Japan back during this war, but it's way more brutal and kind of messed up. So these two guys were officers in the Japanese army, and they made a bet about who could kill the most enemies with their swords alone. So they did this, and this was kind of like a race that was remarked upon day after day in the newspapers. They were racing to who could get to 100 first as they went through, and they had to just use their swords, which has a nice connection back from a Japanese point of view to samurais and bushidos, and kind of showed this warrior thing. So you can see right here, this is the end of it. One of them had 106, the other had 105. They couldn't tell who got to 100 first because it all happened in the middle of this battle. But they were in the newspaper celebrating it, and actually right after this, they decided to have a new race to 150. This was remarked upon in papers. After the war, these two guys were captured, put on trial, and killed, since they were often killing civilians and unarmed prisoners with their swords. But it really goes to show you the way that kind of this military spirit can pervade into an entire society and kind of warp its values. And that's really what fascism is it's this focus on the military, on nationalism, dominating over civilians and over democracy and concepts like that. All right, so next you're going to move on. You're going to read the primary sources that I have attached. You're going to go through them, and at the top I've given some instructions, but just to go over them. If you see highlighted yellow words, you want to define them. That might mean you have to Google them, but I want to make sure you understand all the language being used. From there, there's a continuing question at the top where I want you to keep track of every atrocity that you see committed during this. And then after them, there are the typical questions where it's a fact, where you have to look back and find it in your reading to make sure that you're fully reading everything. And then there's opinion ones where you want to take that information that you read and apply it. Those ones can't be wrong as long as it's an informed opinion. If you don't read it and just write something that's gibberish, you're obviously not going to do as well. I don't think that'll take more than 10-15 minutes, so you guys should be done a little early today. Enjoy.